There's a generation of men walking around right now who never sat on a therapist's couch, never opened a self-help book, and never once said the words, "I need to process this." And somehow, they're fine. Not perfect, not healed in the Instagram sense, but fine. Steady, functional, present at dinner. Showing up for work every single day for 30 years without calling in mentally exhausted. These are Generation X men, the ones born between roughly 1965 and 1980, the forgotten middle child of generations. Not boomers, not millennials. And today, I'm going to show you the 9 habits these men built, often without even realizing it, that gave them a kind of psychological armor. Most people today are desperately trying to buy back through 15 years of expensive therapy sessions. This isn't about therapy being bad. It's about something we lost. A quiet resilience that used to be common and is now rare enough to study like an endangered species. Stick around, because habit number 6 is the one almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important one on this list. Here's why this actually matters, and it's bigger than nostalgia for the 80s and 90s. We are living through what researchers now call a mental health paradox. Never before has a generation had more access to therapy, apps, journaling prompts, mindfulness retreats, and emotional vocabulary. And yet anxiety and depression rates among younger men keep climbing. Something isn't adding up. If therapy alone solved emotional suffering, we'd expect the most therapized generations to be the calmest. They're not. Generation X men grew up in a completely different emotional economy. Latchkey kids, parents who divorced at record rates but rarely discuss feelings about it. No cell phones, no GPS tracking, no constant parental check-ins. They're handed independence early, sometimes too early, and forced to develop internal coping mechanisms simply because no external support system existed. That's the emotional weight here. An entire generation was, in a way, forced into self-reliance by neglect and circumstance. And instead of collapsing under it, which is what modern psychology might predict, many of them built something durable, a kind of emotional callus, not numbness, not suppression exactly, something in between that we've lost the recipe for. The social implication is even heavier. These men are now fathers, uncles, coworkers, and bosses to a generation that's openly struggling. And many of them look at their own kids in therapy for anxiety and quietly wonder, what am I doing differently that they aren't? That question is worth sitting with. Because the answer isn't nothing was wrong with me. It's that something in their daily habits acted like therapy without ever being labeled as such. Let's get into the surprising part, because some of this will genuinely catch you off guard. They processed emotion through motion, not conversation. Here's something almost no one points out. Generation X men rarely talked about their feelings, but they moved constantly. Garage projects, fixing cars, long solo drives with the radio on, basketball at the park until dark. Research on movement and mental health, decades after the fact, confirms that repetitive physical activity activates the same neurological pathways that talk therapy targets, reducing cortisol, increasing dopamine regulation, giving the brain something called bilateral stimulation that essentially processes stress the same way EMDR therapy does today. They weren't doing therapy, they were accidentally doing therapy with a wrench in their hand. Boredom was mandatory, and it built something modern brains never get. This one is uncomfortable to admit. Generation X childhoods were saturated with boredom. No streaming, no infinite scroll, no dopamine drip 24/7. And boredom, it turns out, is one of the most powerful tools for building what psychologists call distress tolerance. The ability to sit with discomfort without immediately needing to escape it. Kids who grew up bored learned, without knowing it, that uncomfortable feelings pass on their own. You didn't need an app to fix restlessness. You needed to survive a rainy Saturday with nothing to do, and eventually your brain adapted. That skill, sitting in discomfort without numbing it, is exactly what most modern therapy tries to rebuild from scratch in adults. They had unsupervised failure, and failure without an audience. Here's the shocking part. Generation X kids failed constantly, and almost nobody was watching. Fell off a bike 2 miles from home, dealt with it alone. got rejected, got in fights, lost games, no parent debriefing every incident, no social media broadcasting it. Failure was private. And private failure, according to modern resilience research, builds something public failure never can, a self-concept that isn't dependent on an audience's reaction. Compare that to today, where failure is often documented, screenshotted, or discussed in group chats before the emotional dust even settles. Generation X men built resilience in silence, literally, because no one else was there to witness it. There's a fourth thing worth mentioning here too, almost hidden in plain sight. Many of these men had jobs, real jobs, physical or repetitive ones, starting as young as 14 or 15, mowing lawns, working at gas stations, bussing tables. That early exposure to responsibility and consequence built what's sometimes called internal locus of control, the belief that your actions determine outcomes rather than external forces. That belief alone is one of the strongest predictors of psychological resilience in every major study on the topic. None of this means their childhoods were healthy by design. A lot of it was neglect dressed up as independence. But the accidental byproduct was a set of coping tools that, frankly, modern therapy spends years trying to manually install in adults who never got the chance to build them naturally. Now let's get into the actual 9 habits, the ones you can extract and apply today, regardless of what generation you belong to. They compartmentalize without avoiding. This is different from suppression. Generation X men learn to put a problem in a box during work hours and open that box later at the right time. It's not about pretending the problem doesn't exist. It's about choosing when to engage with it instead of letting it hijack every moment of the day. They have at least one physical outlet that isn't optional. Whether it's the gym, a garage project, or a weekly pickup game, this isn't self-care. It's non-negotiable maintenance, treated with the same seriousness as brushing your teeth. The consistency itself is the therapy. They rely on a small, tight circle instead of broad emotional disclosure. Not therapy speak, not oversharing, but 2 or 3 people who know exactly what's going on with them, and that's enough. Emotional support doesn't need to be wide, it needs to be deep. They treat responsibility as identity, not burden. Being the guy who shows up for the job, the family, the friend, who needs help moving, became core to their self-worth. And that sense of being needed is one of the strongest protective factors against depression that exists in psychological literature. They practice delayed gratification almost by default. No instant streaming, no next day delivery, no algorithm feeding them dopamine on demand. Waiting was normal. And the ability to tolerate delay, to want something and not need it immediately, is directly linked to lower anxiety and higher life satisfaction in nearly every longitudinal study on self-control. These 5 habits aren't nostalgia, they're a blueprint. And here's the part that should genuinely make you pause. None of these require growing up in the 80s to install. They're behavioral, not generational. Anyone at any age, in any decade, can start compartmentalizing intentionally, building a non-negotiable physical outlet, tightening their circle instead of widening it, anchoring identity in responsibility, and practicing delay instead of instant reaction. The tragedy isn't that Generation X men never needed therapy. Many of them absolutely could have used it for unprocessed trauma, unspoken grief, relationships they never learned how to repair properly. The real insight is that they built an accidental therapeutic system out of ordinary daily habits, simply because no other option existed. And that system, stripped of nostalgia, still works today. So where does that leave us? Not with the conclusion that therapy is unnecessary. Far from it. Therapy exists because some wounds are too specific, too deep, too tangled to unwind alone in a garage with a wrench in your hand. But what these 9 habits reveal is something quieter, that resilience isn't only built in a therapist's office. It's built in repetition, in discomfort you don't immediately escape, in showing up for people who need you, in waiting instead of grabbing, in moving your body instead of only talking about your mind. Generation X men didn't avoid therapy because they were tougher or better. They avoided it because their entire environment flawed as it was, accidentally trained coping mechanisms into their daily lives. One boring Saturday, one solo bike ride, one unsupervised failure at a time. Maybe the real question isn't, why didn't they need therapy? Maybe it's this: what small, unremarkable habit could you start building today, not as a trend, but as a quiet, repeated act that might do for you what none of them ever knew they were doing for themselves?